vast experience.
And live now to an event with a team of election observers recently back from Afghanistan. Most are with the National Democratic Institute, which sent 100 observers into the country on August 20th for that election. Live coverage from the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Dr. Christine Fair, who's a professor at Georgetown, she was out as a long-term observer working on the security. She was doing a security analysis for the elections, and she'll talk about that. She has to leave a little bit early, so she's not upset or offended if you see her slink off on the side. Then we'll have Peter Manicus, who's the regional director for Asia programs at NDI, and he's going to get into more of the nitty-gritty and more of the analysis about the election results and what may happen. He'll be followed by, he's also going to compare with the 04-05 elections. And then Kristen Haffert runs the women's programs at NDI, and she was out in Afghanistan for about 5 weeks monitoring women's participation in the lead up to the elections. She's going to talk about the role of women and the problems women had in participating in the elections. And then finally, last but not least, Ambassador Carl Inderfirth is going to, who was one of the observers, part of the observer team, he'll provide some analysis from his perspective. So without further ado, over to you, Ken.
Thank you very, very much, Karen. Karen has mentioned that NDI has observed some 200 elections around the world, and I have to say at the outset that this was by far the most challenging observation mission that we have ever carried out, and I think I can say on behalf of the other observer delegations that were there, it was perhaps the most challenging for them as well. And we should also not overlook the fact that there was a strong Afghan domestic election observation known by its acronym FIFA that trained and deployed more than 7,000 Afghan observers that did an extraordinary job, and we were very proud to have supported FIFA not only during this election but during its inception prior to the 2004 and 2005 elections. And we relied very much on the relationship that we have developed over the years with FIFA. In addition to the people on this panel who were in the country, we also benefited measurably by a leadership group that included former Senator Gary Hart, John Manley, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Canada, who headed the Manley Commission that was sponsored by the Government of Canada 2 years ago, or a year ago, that looked into Canada's engagement in Afghanistan, and also Nora Owen, the former Justice Minister of Ireland. That leadership team also was informed by, as Karen said, 27 long-term observers who were in Afghanistan since July, that were stationed in every region of the country. Also by individuals who were looking at functional areas. Christine, who was examining the Afghan security forces, Kristen Heffert, who was examining women's participation, and a third person who is still in Afghanistan now, who was looking at the election administration and the complaints process. Trying to deal with the security issue in Afghanistan was the most difficult challenge for our delegation and the other observer groups that were there. We tried to deal with this issue with some creativity. First, we tried to deploy in as many provinces as we could. We ended up being in 19 of the 34 provinces, which I think was more provinces than any of the other observer groups. We were able to do so because of a separate program NDI was engaged in, and that was training some 31,000 candidate agents at polling sites in the months leading up to the election. And that was a program that was supported by the UNDP. And the trainers for that program were a very talented group of Afghans who have been with the Institute for the past several years. They could go where internationals could not. They knew the election procedures and the laws better than anybody, and we benefited greatly from their reports, which were were among the best that were coming in from very difficult areas. We made a strategic decision at the outset not to send internationals into provincial reconstruction teams. Others decided to do that. We would rather benefit from Afghan observers who were well trained and knowledgeable, because we feared that we would be fighting to get into the PRTs, and then we would be fighting to try to get out of the PRTs on Election Day. And I think many of the other observers found out that once they were in the PRTs on Election Day, they were either denied an opportunity to leave, or they could only see polling sites in the immediate vicinity of the PRTs. So I think it was a good decision. I think we were able to garner a lot of information on Election Day, but in the name of full disclosure, I would have to admit that we, like the Afghan voters, were hampered by the insecure environment in a number of parts of the country. And we have to admit it, we have to deal with that issue, that we could not go to certain provinces where we wanted to go, and we could not go to certain places within certain provinces that we would have wanted to go. Nevertheless, we received literally hundreds of reports, and some of those are reflected in the statement that you have that was released in Kabul, and they will be part of a larger final report. I think our statement reflected a measured assessment, our preliminary statement of the election. We talked about some of aspects of the election that were consistent with democratic principles, but at the same time we talked about serious flaws in the process, and needless to say, the insecure environment in a number of parts of the country. As we look at this election now, and with all the problems that have emerged, some of them we witnessed directly, there are two perhaps silver linings. The first is a highly sophisticated software system that the Independent Election Commission possesses. And that software allows for certain votes coming from certain stations to be quarantined if there seems to be anomalies or evidence of fraud. And from our observers who are watching the count now, it seems as though that software system is working. And there are a number of results from stations that have been quarantined. What happens to those votes, we do not know as of yet. The second silver lining is the Electoral Complaints Commission itself. From all the elections that we observed around the world, this is a very unique institution. Perhaps it reflects the weakness of the judicial system in Afghanistan, but there are very few countries around the world that immediately after the election that you have a body that can investigate complaints quickly, can adjudicate those complaints, and has the authority to annul results. And they can do all this before the final results are certified. A lot of responsibility falls on the ECC, but I can tell you in most countries the complaints go to the judiciary or to a special electoral tribunal, and sometimes it takes months, if not years, before complaints are resolved. In the case of Nigeria, before the last elections, they were annulling results in elections when people had been seated in office for 3 years already. So this is a unique process, and I think it gives us some hope that the problems that we have been reading about and the problems that we have observed will be dealt with, and we hope that's the case. Finally, I think there's two things I want to say. The first is that this was not simply a presidential election. This was 34 elections. One election dealt with the president, and 34 elections dealt with provincial councils. And so we have to look at this election in a much broader way. The provincial councils in Afghanistan is the only sub-national entity that interfaces with citizens. And if the provincial council fails to perform its role under very difficult and challenging conditions, that the Afghan people ultimately could very well lose faith in the entire governing structure of their country. And yet they face enormous challenges. On one hand, a highly centralized government that has been reluctant to devolve authority beyond the governors, provincial reconstruction teams that are dispensing a good deal of development funds, local warlords, and therefore, because of these conditions, you have provincial councils that don't have budget authority that begin to get marginalized because of all these conditions. And I believe that it behooves the international community. It's a little bit self-serving. NDI has been working with about 20 of the provincial councils from 7 offices around the country. But it behooves the international community to spend more time building up the capacity of these councils so they can fulfill their responsibilities in the country. And finally, let me make the point about the election. There are those before this election, and there are those that now make the case that the best outcome in Afghanistan is for a first-round declaration of a victor, and that perhaps a power-sharing agreement that could avoid the ethnic tensions that may emerge in the run-up to a second round. I would argue, however, that the most important goal for both the Afghan people, and particularly those who courageously turned out at the polls and defied the violence and the threat of violence, and for the international community, is first the integrity of the process, wherever that leads us, and secondly, to the issue of legitimacy of the government that emerges from this election, both at the national and the local level. And I doubt whether the Afghan people would have gone into this election feeling that the best outcome would have been some behind-the-scenes deal between a handful of leaders to avoid a process that was to reflect the hopes and aspirations and the will of the people.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ken. Over to you, Christine.
So as you heard, my task was to go around and meet with several of the other long-term observer teams. I went to Jalalabad. I met with our poor team in Kunduz, as well as Herat, and of course I spent time in Kabul. So my task was to try to understand how the security environment shaped the credibility of the multiple elections that Ken discussed. And I think in many places security was an over-determining factor in the sense that it sort of set a ceiling as to how credible some of those elections could be. Prior to the election itself, the security environment shaped the availability of updating the registration list. Some folks were simply unable to update the registration list. In some cases, folks were very able to register because you could actually buy the registration cards in the open market. And you would have the peculiar outcome of having enormous numbers of women registered. And I'm not sure it's because the liberated ladies of Oruzgan were out there claiming their franchise. So even going into the election, the security environment shaped or put a limit in terms of how credible that exercise would eventually be. The security arrangements that were in place, the actual security, the actual polling station itself, the first perimeter of security was the police, the outer perimeter was the ANA, and then in actual extremis, ISAF was supposed to be the provider of security. There were set up these things called operational coordination centers, both at the regional level, with the regional commands, but also at the provincial level. We had a chance to go to one of those in Kunduz, and to say that it was stood up at the last minute, I think would be flattering for the organization that was in place. So the standing up of the OCCs were very uneven across the country, and some of them were literally constituted only the week before the election. And yet it's the OCCs that were supposed to be gathering information throughout the province and trying to come up with an appropriate security response. Interestingly enough, there was supposed to be in place a UNDP elect ran it. It was a police training program. It was a train the trainer program. In theory, the police were trained in this sort of cascading fashion, but the reality was that under the best assumptions, the police that were used on Election Day maybe got 3 hours or so of election training, and certainly one has to wonder what the outcomes were of that training, given that the police capacity in Afghanistan writ large is really leaves something to be desired. That, I think, is a larger concern about the Afghan elections, is that police are so important, yet police have really lagged behind the training of the Afghan National Army, which I think everyone would agree is a success. I think most people would say the Afghan National Police training has not been a success. So you would have areas such in Kunduz, where for a district you had maybe 50 police officers, and so it's not a surprise in those districts you had Taliban, running roughshod, which seriously restricted the ability of people to actually turn out on Election Day. Another interesting thing that we stumbled across was that the Afghans had really delayed recruiting female security agents, the women that will pat you down before you go down to vote. And this should have been anticipated to be a problem, because outside of the capital, it's difficult to recruit women, period, for security jobs, even more so once you leave the capital. And in some cases, this task was left to about 2 weeks before Election Day. So that seemed to have been a fairly large but ultimately preventable oversight. Another interesting thing that we heard a lot about before the election, but it was definitely the dog that didn't bark, and that was what could be humorously called the Nurbakai. Some of you know about the so-called militias called Arbakai. President Karzai's brother-in-law, Nurzai, actually put together circa sometime in June or July a somewhat national militia plan that aimed to deploy between 10 and 13,000 militias. Conveniently, they were largely planned to be deployed mostly in the South. It was never clear what these guys were supposed to do. Would they be armed? Would they bring their own gun? How would they be uniformed? How would the police know that they're legitimate militias and not illegitimate militias? No one that we've spoken to or that I've spoken to on Election Day saw a heavy presence of these militias. Reasons for this have ranged from a fellow colleague of mine down in Logar. He said, well, I just think the governor ran off with the money. So who knows why we didn't see those militias, but there was a lot of apprehension about them before Election Day. Now, about violence itself, before the election, as we all know, there was considerable violence targeting candidates, party workers, campaign managers. And while we don't have the complete universe of victims of violence or threats of violence, it does look as if women were more vulnerable. Candidates routinely complained that they had inadequate security. The Ministry of Interior told them that they could go out and hire their own folks, but they said they'd pay them. It wasn't clear how they would get paid, how they would be armed. So there was a fairly consistent concern among candidates they were not getting the security that they needed. And obviously, leading into the election, voters themselves were intimidated. In Taliban-controlled areas, there were reports that the Talibs were taking advantage of the mosque to issue sermons, making it very clear that there'd be reprisals if they voted. We all heard about if your finger has the ink, we're going to cut your finger off. In Helmand, the threat escalation went up to your head being removed if you voted. But again, there were certainly afterwards reports of this, but the Taliban really did not. They did not honor their pledge to violence in the fullest. Another thing that came up quite often was that Afghans themselves were uncertain about the security arrangements that the government put into place. Now, Afghans were very conspiratorial about this. Their assessment was, well, it behooves the incumbent to basically have an environment of insecurity to discourage voter turnout, the logic being less voter turnout, greater opportunities for fraud. Whether or not that's true or not, that's just how it was interpreted. But going forward for future elections, the government might actually want to invest some effort trying to explain to the citizenry that this is the security preparations that are going to be here, therefore you should feel secure in casting your vote. There were a number of really interesting reports, and we saw some of this in the press yesterday, right, in the New York Times. There were all sorts of stories that Karzai had actually cut deals with Talib commanders, by which no one would cast a vote, so that would keep the Taliban happy, but the Taliban also would not stop ballot boxes being returned, full of votes. And I think some of you saw the press reporting yesterday that in Kandahar there was 23,947 votes returned for Karzai, when in fact no one had the opportunity to cast a vote. So I think that perhaps another area that might merit thinking about is that we've sort of thought about security as shaping the electoral exercise, but many people actually said security was actually used as an excuse to disenfranchise some voters. We heard quite a number of concerns that areas were deemed to be insecure because they were not areas that were expected to support the incumbent. There were considerable disagreements between the IEC and the security forces about which polling centers could be open. And in Kunduz, I mean, it wasn't clear what polling centers were going to be open until the absolute last minute. We know that because we had an LTO team up there. The problem with that is that in some cases they decided to co-locate polling centers. So if you actually looked at the polling centers that were open, you would have polling centers moved out from the outside of the district into the district center. So you could say, oh yes, we had polling centers open in the district. The problem, of course, is Afghanistan has very poor logistics. The roads are really, not practicable. And so women in particular, if they had to move large distances to polling centers, it would be tantamount to being disenfranchised. So while at first blush it looks as if co-locating polling centers to a district center for security reasons might have some advantages, it did have the effect of making it impossible for many people to actually cast their vote. So, moving forward, especially if there's a runoff, I think there are a number of things that really need to be thought out today, not the day before the runoff. And certainly if there is not a runoff, thinking about the next set of elections, namely the parliamentary elections. Police training has to remain a focus. The international community, as much as the Afghan government, is culpable for the lack of police on election day. We've known about these elections for some time, yet the police training billets still remain understaffed at 30%. To quote a U.S. government official last summer, that's great unless you actually want to win. So it's incomprehensible why police training has remained a low priority amongst the international community. And it's, the Americans are paying the bills, we're largely doing the training. It would be great if some of our NATO ISAF partners would step up. That has to be a priority. And similarly, greater effort needs to be done to get female search agents. Whatever the security arrangements are in place, the government really needs to communicate that, because it makes no difference whether they have the best security arrangement in place if Afghans don't actually believe that they're going to be secure in casting their vote. And then finally, we really do need some accountability about what these militias were doing, if anything. As I said, we've had a lot of difficulty tracking down what the militias were actually up to. But I think the very fact that Karzai's brother-in-law put this plan into place and the way in which they were deployed looked somewhat dubious. There really needs to be an accounting of what those guys were up to. And going forward, when we look at the Norzai-Arbakai plan, the international community kind of signed off on it. And the logic sort of went like this: in the South, if people couldn't get out to register, couldn't get out to vote, then the credibility of the election would be in peril. I think the message needs to be from the international community that militias are actually no excuse for police. And so if you're going to go out of your way to try to have a reasonably competent militia force, you probably are better served taking those efforts and trying to get them into actual police training billets. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. Okay, over to you, Peter, for some trends and comparison with 0405.
Sure. Thank you very much, Karen. Well, the news reports I think that we're receiving every day now present an unrelentingly negative picture of what's going on in Afghanistan. In fact, I think it's reflected in our statement that our delegation found that the election was really difficult to characterize in a single phrase. Violence and fraud have clearly marred the electoral process and now threatens the legitimacy of any new government. But unfortunately, those reports overshadow some aspects of the election period, I think, that were pretty positive and an improvement over the elections in 2004 and 05. Unlike the election campaigns of the past, these elections, in fact, involved issues. The candidates campaigned throughout the country. Abdullah was able to go to remote districts in the Pashtun South. Barshadost had a van traveling throughout the country communicating his populist message, and President Karzai, of course, could travel almost everywhere trying to make a deal, as did Abdullah, in fact. It was well covered by the news media. Our long-term observers were reporting that throughout the country, small groups of people were getting together, talking about the campaign, discussing the issues. Abdullah was communicating a message of more decentralization, a parliamentary as opposed to a presidential system. And they were talking about Karzai's record and his approach to governance. Political parties played a role in this campaign that they had not played in the past. There were about 10 or so parties that were able to field candidates in between 5 and 10 provinces for the provincial council races. For the first time, party names appeared on the ballot. That had never been the case in the past. It promises to help establish an effective party system that's been so far totally absent. There were more women participating in this campaign. There were more women candidates for provincial councils than there had ever been in the past. And millions of Afghans voted despite the threat of violence. All of those, I think, were important things that, in discussing the election, we don't want to entirely overlook. Unfortunately, there was really little that was done over the past 5 years to sort of improve the process and address a lot of the defects in the system that were very apparent back in 2004 and 05. Perhaps foremost among them is the millions of duplicate and counterfeit registration cards that have just flooded the country. Months before the election, you could buy such a card for about $10. As the election approached, the price had inflated quite considerably. What people were doing with the cards, of course, was not entirely a mystery. They were being sold to people that wanted to commit some sort of electoral fraud. They're used in schemes both for ballot stuffing and for proxy voting, and they really threaten to sort of delegitimize the entire process if something's not done about it. Local election officials have not been well trained. They're quite well trained at the national level for the most part. The local level we saw in 04 and 05 that they were not capable of fully sort of understanding the process. They implemented the inking poorly back then, and we saw the same problems emerge at the local level now. And in addition to that, they're recruited locally, so they're subject to political pressures at the village level, and which, of course, leads into the proxy voting and ballot stuffing. The absence of a functioning judicial system really that results in widespread immunity for anybody who engages in electoral misconduct. All these things had been out there. Everybody knew about them. Very little was done. I think about 5 or 6 months before the election, there was kind of a renewed effort to pour resources into the system and to fill all the observable gaps that people saw in the electoral administration, but it was too late. You can't deal with problems of millions of voter registration cards in the system just a few months out. We have another election coming up in in October, I guess. If these problems aren't addressed now, they really threaten the entire legitimacy of the process. Then there's not much time. What has to be done immediately is to reconstitute the Electoral Complaints Commission. It expires sort of automatically about 30 days or so after the certification of the results, and it has to be reestablished. They should do so immediately because the ECC really didn't have time to prepare for this current election. There's a lot of other things. Just planning for security is something that really requires several months, and that was done very late in this process as well. As Karen mentioned, the results are still coming in. This process is not over. We're watching it play out day by day. 60% of the votes have been counted, as Karen said. A lot of the votes that haven't been counted are in the Pashtun South. There have been, but those are presumably Karzai votes, but there's also fewer votes down there. So how that plays out in the end is kind of anybody's guess. The question, of course, is that if it's 51% for Mr. Karzai, is that going to be widely accepted in the Afghan population? Are there going to be suspicions that that's not a sort of a legitimate result. A lot of talk about a deal. You know, when we were there, we were talking to both Afghans and people in the international community about brokering some sort of arrangement. All that's going to be playing out over the next several weeks. So that's where we are. The complaint process continues. As I mentioned, there are 2,000 complaints have been filed. 500 are considered serious. By serious, I mean can affect the outcome of the election. So we wait, as you do, for the final tallies.
Great. Thank you very much. And now over to you, Kristen, to talk about women's role in the election.
Thanks, Karen. As Karen mentioned earlier, I was in Afghanistan for 5 weeks monitoring women's participation in the lead up to the elections, and I had a very unique experience in that I was able to spend quite a bit of time speaking with many of the female provincial candidates during that time. And so what I thought I'd do today, I mean, some of the challenges that women had in the election have been mentioned already: security, proxy voting. But what I thought would be interesting is if I sort of gave you a glimpse of what I heard from these candidates and give you a little bit more of a sense of what we heard on the ground from their perspective. Prior to the elections, NDI trained 226 of the 333 women who ran for provincial council. And for most of these women, it was the only training they'd ever had in their lives. And this was particularly important because for 122 of them, they'll automatically get seats on the provincial council due to the 25% quota. Of these 200 women, NDI selected 18 women from 9 of the provinces. And we interviewed those candidates 3 times, 2 times prior to the election and once after. And through these interviews, we were really able to sort of glean information that we weren't able to get even through our short-term observers and our long-term observers, partly because some of them were in provinces where we didn't have a presence due to security concerns. And so we were able to sort of track their experiences as candidates throughout the election, but also hear from them what they saw in female polling stations on Election Day. So, unsurprisingly, I mean, you've heard security was really the #1 concern that all of them expressed. And Christine mentioned the co-location of polling sites, which really prevented many women from traveling to be able to vote. And while this was definitely true in the South and the Southeast, this was actually true once you really got out in many provinces out of the urban areas, or just out of the city. One woman said to us in Ghazni, "I rented a car with my personal money to take some women to the polling station, but they refused riding in my vehicle and told me that they're not permitted by their families to get in those cars." And that's really what we heard. Although the 18 women that we interviewed all went out and cast their votes for themselves, they knew from friends and families that the male members of the family were not permitting women to go out and vote. And it was interesting because we saw on Election Day that women actually came out later in the day. Men were out, the lines were longer earlier, and then it looks like women sort of swelled in the afternoon, which may have actually been a result of the security concerns. Women also told us that, as Christine mentioned, the challenge of recruiting female staff was very high, and they saw women who were unprepared. It was sort of a mix. There were some women who were prepared and really following everything to a T, and other women who were uneducated, unprepared. And these candidates that we spoke with really had a concern that that would sort of create an enabling environment for fraud. One of the challenges, of course, was security and recruiting female staff, both to check IDs and as security guards, but also the lack of literacy, especially in the rural areas, was another major challenge that women cited to being able to recruit staff. As far as the voter IDing goes, we heard from many women that women in burqas would go to vote and actually weren't their faces weren't checked against their pictures on their voter card, and the photos on the voter cards were actually optional. So in many cases where there weren't photos, women still weren't asked to sort of give the name of their father and were just allowed to vote without any sort of screening. As we also heard a great deal from the women candidates that we spoke with about proxy voting, and we heard more about young females voting than we did actually male members of families going. We heard both, but we heard quite a number of instances where women, young women in burqas under the age of 18, went in and voted, and they had voter registration cards, so they were actually permitted to vote. So that speaks to really the flaws in the registration process. One woman said in Herat, she said, "I was informed by my brother, who was my agent in a mail polling station, that he had observed some cases of proxy voting. In a specific case, a man wanted to vote on behalf of his wife and daughters, reasoning that they were not allowed to get out of the house on election day. He was further arguing that this is his right to vote instead of his female family members." Women also requested that their fingers not be inked, and actually their requests were granted for fear of retribution from the Taliban. Just on the issue of female candidates in particular, we heard a number of instances really throughout the country, including in Kabul, of women being warned of a landmine on their way to a campaign event, night letters, anonymous phone calls. In fact, one woman gave us the number of the man in Pakistan who called to threaten her in case we wanted to follow up with him. But also, you know, a lot of these things actually took place in Kabul, so you can imagine sort of the extent to which some of these threats took place in the south and southeast, where there were gunfights in front of some female candidates' houses. We had one woman in Kandahar who said she left her province, went to live with relatives, and had been there for 3 weeks in the lead up to the election, obviously not allowing her to campaign because of major threats that she had, and men sort of coming around her house. With armed men coming around her house. So you can really see, I mean, I was struck by really how brave these women were, and after being in 50 countries, I actually think these were some of the bravest women that I've ever met in my life. Also, just briefly on the candidates, because women had limited access to public space, as they do in daily life in Afghanistan, you really saw women campaigning indoors. They talked about how they actually lit up when they talked about going door to door. They were really pleased with the receptivity they had when they went into friends' homes and families' homes. But the interesting thing is they were often really campaigning to women, because it sounded like these gatherings were very much gatherings of women. And then you had women to a large degree disenfranchised. So I think it was interesting that that they were campaigning really just to women in large part. There was exception for some of the incumbents. They had access to some large gatherings, but in large part we heard from the women that really from the time that they get acceptance from their family to run, which is absolutely critical, they're really reliant on men for every aspect of their campaigns. Most of them really talked about how they got permission from elders and tribal leaders and religious leaders to run, and then, you know, in very lucky cases, those men were able to, you know, provide opportunities for them to speak in mosques. But really, you saw it was the elders and the leaders who opened the door and asked people to open the door for women to go into people's homes to campaign, which was still really done in a private way. Across the world you hear this, but in particularly in Afghanistan, the fundraising and the ability to have any sort of small money to campaign was really a challenge. And you saw women's posters, but a lot of times they were black and white instead of colored ones. And they, you know, women felt like they weren't able to compete on the same level as men because they weren't able to have this sort of visibility. And UNIFEM actually had a women's resource center, and they allowed for women to come in and print 1,000 posters for free of their campaign posters. And you saw that 36 women came from various provinces, traveled to Kabul just to print 1,000 posters to hang up in their districts. Just finally, we'll have the conclusions and recommendations in our final report, but I think, as you've already heard, many of the challenges that women faced really could have been addressed with more preparation, particularly the staffing in the polling stations and the security guards, which really was a sort of rushed effort at the very last minute to try to prepare for. We already included in our statement a recommendation for increased civic outreach to women and men on the issue of women's participation and the importance of everyone voting and the privacy of the importance of the privacy of the vote. And finally, the ability to verify female voters without any sort of way of identifying women with a photo or whatever the case may be. If it's eye scan or something more sophisticated, you really have no way of verifying that a woman is who she says she is. So with that, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Kristen. Now over to you, Ambassador Inderford.
Thank you, Karen. I'm delighted to have a chance to be the final speaker so I can build on the points already made by my colleagues, my Kabul colleagues, I should add. We had a great experience observing this election. I'd like to step back and call attention to some larger points here and use that as our concluding comment before we go to questions and answers. I'd like to start with what Kristen had to say. Now, I'm looking at our report that we did. I trust that you have seen that, particularly the overview that we have and the recommendations. I want to start where she left off. We say in the report that the rights of women in the electoral process require special attention. I just want to underscore that. We had an opportunity to meet with 3 male and 3 female candidates for the Provincial Council in Kabul. We had a good discussion with them. The women that were there were extraordinary. They were the most animated and motivated and articulate. They clearly see the stakes in this election for them and what is important here. Kristen said when we were in Kabul that these were the bravest women that she has seen in covering many elections and seeing the role of women. I'd have to underscore that. The women there also know that if the darkness descends again on Afghanistan, they will pay the greatest price. So while we're looking at large issues of al-Qaeda and all of the security issues, we cannot forget fundamental principles and values at stake in what goes on there. Secondly, I do want to call attention to the reference in the report to the security situation. Obviously, violence and the threat of violence shaped this election. And we say in the report that it is critical for the growth and survival of the nation's incipient democratic process that the continuing insurgency is brought to an end. Obvious point, but it needs to be restated here, and we've all seen that General McChrystal has now forwarded his recommendations. This is a big issue, but we can't get Afghanistan right unless we get the security part of this right. So I wanted to call attention to that. We've already heard from Peter and others about where the international community fell down in the run-up to this election. We heard from Grant Kippen, who is president of the ECC, saying that the international community took its eye off the ball after the 2005 election for the next several years.